Okay, so this is Marty Wilson speaking. I'm sitting here with Sara Cornell. It's November 17th, 2021. We're at the Monroe County Historical Association. And the Executive Director, Amy Lizer, is going to participate as well in this interview.
Okay.
So, Sara, by the way, I like the way you spell your name. That's the way my daughter spells her name.
All the good Sarahs do not have an H.
Right. So could you tell us a little bit about when you were born, where you were born, your parents, just to get us started here?
Sure. I was actually born in 1960, so that'll tell you how old I am. And I was actually born in Lehighton, which is where my parents and I lived until I was 3 years old. At that point in time, my parents moved to Stroudsburg, and we actually lived on Route 611, up where I believe Eastern Penn Supply still is. That was my father's first job in Stroudsburg, was being a manager for Eastern Penn Supply. And then he started his own business with some investors at the end of Main Street, which was Best Supply, and he started that in 1965. So shortly thereafter, probably in 1969, he had purchased a house that my mother had never seen before, which was now known as the Trach-Hunsicker house, which is out in Saylorsburg. So I grew up there. My connection with Stroudsburg came about because since my parents owned the business at the end of Main Street, I shouldn't say the end of Main Street, but the end of the business district of Main Street, I spent every summer there, sometimes after school, and that went on from probably the time I was 9 years old until I was 18. So I spent a lot of my time literally walking from the old Best Supply Company up the road all the way down to the Sherman Theater. So that's how I got to know Stroudsburg very well. When I was probably younger, probably 9, 10, 11, I actually went to camp at the day camp that they ran at the Stroudsburg pool, which at that point was next to, I guess it was between Morey School and the high school. So that was a pretty active camp. So when I got a little older, no more camp and monkey bars, so then I just kind of walked downtown. So
the house you grew up in is this one out in Saylorsburg that your dad bought?
Yes.
You know, we were talking before you got here. I think I bicycled by that house. Is it currently for sale?
Yes.
And does the house kind of sit sideways to the road and there's
Yes.
a barn there?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, it's a beautiful house.
Mm-hmm.
So you own that house now?
My parents technically still own it. They're actually in an assisted living facility in Bethlehem now. So we're basically selling the house as a way to continue to fund that. They are both 91 years old. So my dad will turn 92 on the 28th of this month.
How about that? Wow.
How about that?
So I know we want to talk about the house a little bit and
Sure.
maybe this flag that you donated, but
Mm-hmm.
and we also want to talk about Stroudsburg, what you
Mm-hmm.
remember. And since you started talking about Stroudsburg, what do you remember about this Main Street in Stroudsburg?
I remember a lot about it actually, and it was actually kind of fun. It was totally different than it is now. And like I said, you know, before I walked in here, I actually drove down Main Street and came back. And of course, with the cemetery tour, you know, we got to see a lot of it. At the time that I would have been taking my, as I call them, walks down through Stroudsburg, I would have been anywhere, like I said, from probably 11 on up. At that time, it was safe to do that. You know, people look at me now and they're like, why were you 11 and 12 and you were walking like literally from way up there all the way down? But you could do that at that point in time. It was 50 years ago.
This is like the 70s, early 70s.
Yes, yeah. So it was perfectly safe to do that. And later on, as I got older, I took over, well, that was much later, but I did a lot of the bookkeeping and helped with like a lot of things around the business. And I would walk from there to what was then Monroe Security Bank with a large bank envelope with $20,000, $30,000 in it. And I would just walk to the bank with it and walk back, and nobody thought anything of it. I never ever considered like, oh yeah, somebody could, you know, steal this bag and run away. Nothing, just, you know, obviously when I was a little bit younger than that, I had free reign. I started out at the youngest just going to the library, and I would spend a lot of time in the library. one particular summer, I remember, actually got a little sticker from the librarian because I read 142 books in one summer.
And the library we're talking about was right across the
Yes.
street from where we are now.
It's now the Bar Association.
Yeah.
So I have very fond memories of that. In fact, different books, when I open up old books, it has a smell that always reminds me of that library because it was always so dark in there. And I always thought it was cool to go up in the really dark area where they had all the like murder mysteries. And I remember even, you know, as a kid going in there and with some of those rounded walls, it always reminded me like we're in a castle. So I had a lot of, I don't know, pretend stuff going on up there, but I loved that library. I was actually really sad, believe it or not, when they moved the library and built this brand new building because it was just always fun in there.
Yeah.
And you could be in there for hours and you would never see like another person. And I just remember I'd carry down like 10, 15 books at a time, check them out, and I'd walk back to the office and then I'd just read them and I'd be back a week later. In fact, I still have my library card somewhere.
I remember when my daughter used to go there a lot. Didn't they have a turtle or something that walked around? Do you remember that? Was it a
Yes.
turtle?
Mm-hmm.
Does that go back to the 70s too? Okay.
It does.
So maybe one way to approach this is what's still on Main Street that was there then, and then we'll talk about what is not there anymore. Like for example, the YMCA was there.
Yeah, that was always there. Not a whole lot. Now, Dunkelberger's has been there for a long time, but not in that location. They were actually a couple stores down in just a very small area. I think originally they were on 6th Street and then moved across Main Street. But Teddy Bear, which every time I say Teddy Bear, non-local people think it was a teddy bear store that sold teddy bears. But it was just like a variety store, I guess you would call it. I love that store. That was one of my favorite places, and I was thinking about that actually when I was driving down. And what I liked about it, of all the stupid things, was you went in one door, and it was like these big heavy doors, and then you came out a different door. And that to me at the time seemed like a very novel thing. It wasn't like came in and out the same door. There's a regular entrance and exit. And it was always dark in there too.
Where was this?
This was right where Dunkelberger's is now.
Oh, I see.
So it was, yeah, that's exactly where it was. And then it was there for many, many years. They went out of business, and then it became the Loose Goose Factory Outlet. And I never went in the Loose Goose because I was on some silent protest. Again, I was probably like 12 or 13, that Teddy Bears was no longer there, and I was never going in that other store, and I never did. So I have no idea what they sold there or what it was like. But Teddy Bears was just a very unique store. They sold everything. And again, it was dark. I don't know what it was about the 70s in particular, but I just remember every store you could like barely see what you were looking at. Wyckoffs was the same way. I just remember that was very dark in there too. Mm-hmm. So John's Bargain Store was another store very similar to that, like more of a 5 and dime kind of free-for-all kind of store. They just had everything laid out on tables. The whole store was these big brown tables with just stuff on top of it. Everything from clothes to shoes to toys, everything. But as far as what else would be there, Sew and Back is still around. It was down further. So a lot of the places that still exist now were actually in different locations originally.
So Sew and Back presently, it used to be an A&P, was that? Yeah.
Yeah, they used to be down further than that.
Okay.
So they would be down, I think there's a music store still.
There was a music store down
Okay.
there. Yeah, it's long gone.
Okay. So I think they used to be down in that vicinity.
Okay.
And then they moved up for a while. They were the opposite direction up near the State Store, which I'm not sure if that's still there.
Okay.
That's not still there either? Okay. And now they're at the old IGA.
What was Wyckoffs like?
Wyckoffs was another really neat store, and I have a lot of actually good memories from that store because they sold clothing, small appliances, pretty much everything. And then they had this basement. And in the basement area, they had like all kinds of like odds and ends. They had tools for a while. There was a Sears downstairs. They had the tea room. So that was actually kind of a fun place to go for lunch. And I used to go there pretty often with my mother. And we'd have lunch in the tea room, which was, we'd always see friends of my mother's, friends from her bridge club, and it always seemed when I was a little kid that we were like celebrities there. We weren't, of course, but it seemed that way.
Because she knew so many people?
Yes, and she was active in a lot of different organizations, so we would always see people there that she knew. What I liked about it also was they had a counter. So the tea room was in the back, and you had to walk up a couple steps to get to it. Right before that, they had like a, I guess you'd call it a lunch counter. So you could sit at the counter for like faster service, but they had ice cream there. Oh. Only place in this town in the 70s that served chocolate chip mint ice cream. That was why I went there.
What about J.J. Newberries? Was that still up and running when you?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What was that? Store?
Newberries, yeah, that was kind of a cool place too. They also had a lunch counter. You could eat lunch at like every store almost within like a block radius. It was like a split block. So I would go there for milkshakes because they had the better milkshakes. But it was an interesting store because the lunch counter was like all the way when you walked in to the right, but all the way to the left, they sold like Texas grinders at some counter that was not having anything to do with anything. And in between there, they had clothing and toys and souvenirs for tourists. I think the funniest thing about that store was they had an escalator, and that was like a big deal at the time. And I know like as kids, we used to want to go in there because there was an escalator, and where else could you find that? It went down to the downstairs basement. And here's an odd collection of things. They sold fabric down there, like on the big rolls. And the other thing they sold down there were fish and snakes. So they had this weird little mini pet section. Sometimes they had, I think, rabbits, but I'm not sure. It wasn't like dogs and cats, things like that, but they had fish tanks and like lizards and snakes and a fabric store. Huh. To this day, I do not understand that combination. And for years, a lot of people didn't realize there was even a basement, or they didn't know where it went because, again, bad lighting, people didn't know where it went, so people didn't go down there. So it was really odd. And then at a certain point in time, they did close off that basement, and Newberries was still operating as Newberries, but there was no downstairs. And then after that, the lunch counter kind of went by the wayside, and then so did the whole store. But,
did you ever go into Penstrous?
Mm-hmm.
What was that? What do you remember about the Penstrous?
Actually, well, quite a bit because I don't think it was the Penstrous at the time. That had undergone so many name changes. I think probably about the time that I'm talking about, like the 70s, it was still the Penstrous. And I believe late 70s, again, don't quote me on that date, the Andrews family bought it. Blanking on the father's first name, but it'll come to me eventually. And it was a Hilton for a while. And I definitely remember that because when I got married to my first husband, that's where our wedding reception was. Oh. So years and years and years later, fast forward to the 90s, I believe the son of Mr. Andrews owned it. And I had had another party there for an exchange student that had lived with me for a year. But at that point, it was no longer a Hilton. I think it was a Best Western at that point in time. And I know it's gone through a couple other changes, and I think now it's back to the Penstrous. Yeah. So, but I mean, back in the 70s and early 80s, I mean, it was phenomenal in there, and it was like the place to go.
Busy?
Very much so.
Yeah.
So I don't know what happened. At one point in time, it just seemed like it kind of, I don't know, kind of was pretty decrepit. I don't know that they really kept up with a lot of repairs. So I know over time they've closed different floors periodically and did a lot of renovations.
Was that a luncheonette on the counters there then?
Yeah.
So there were a lot of places to eat lunch.
Oh my gosh,
In town
yes.
back
Back in the 70s and early 80s, Woolworths, which would have been next to Wyckoffs, they had a lunch counter there too. They kind of had a unique thing where they always had balloons, and you could pop a balloon and you would get a discount of either 10% or 20% off what you ordered at the lunch counter,
Really?
like certain days of the week. So that was kind of neat. All of them had those old-fashioned round stools, you know, so you could literally, like I said, go to Newberries, Woolworths, or Wyckoffs for lunch. And I just had particular favorite things at each one, so.
So do you think town was busier in general then? Would there be more people walking on the streets than there are today?
Yeah, I think so. I really do. Now, as far as recently, I haven't really been active in this area for 10 years because I live closer to Wilkes-Barre at this point. But yeah, and I think it was a very friendly kind of town, but it was all local. There were obviously, you know, tourists at the time, but it was mostly local people. I would walk down there and I'd run into friends of mine. So then it would be 3 or 4 of us. We'd stop for pizza or we'd go to Woolworths or whatever. It was just the thing to do.
I sort of remember Thursday night was a special night. Do you remember anything about Thursday nights? The stores were open late on Thursday nights, or?
Oh, that could be, yeah.
Well, what about the YMCA? Were you a member of the Y? Did you go to the Y?
Not until I was like an adult, probably like late 80s.
Yeah.
And I would take my kids swimming there and for swimming lessons. But I don't think I was ever really a member there. And at that point in time, it wasn't really a place that I knew anybody who really went there. I do remember where Dunkin' Donuts is now, on the other side of the Y, used to be a auto mechanic garage and a gas station, long before Dunkin' Donuts got there.
Yeah, do you remember who ran it or who owned it?
I don't.
Didn't Donnie Nickman have something to do with that? Did you know Donnie Nickman?
Oh yeah. My dad did business with almost every person in this town, so there's a lot of, if it was a builder, contractor, or plumber, we probably knew who they were. You know, it's funny when I talk to my dad, even now, he'll talk about different people, and he'll mention him and many, many other people. And of course, he's like pretty much the only one still alive, which is phenomenal to me. And, you know, I think it hasn't really occurred to him yet when he talks about a lot of like past customers. He'll say, oh, I wonder whatever happened to him. And I'm like, well, I saw his obituary a couple weeks ago. I just think he doesn't think about like, wow, I'm 91 and some of these people would have been older than him. But,
What else about Main Street strikes, you know, do you remember?
I just think there were so many different things going on. I know every Saturday during the summer, there was always an art show in the courthouse square. And that was always fun. And they'd block off, you know, parts of other blocks. There would be a lot of different festivals or parades, things like that. And I think it was just more kid-friendly. Down at the very end of Main Street, on the right-hand side, there was a slot car racing business.
Oh, yeah.
I think it was called R&S or R&L. I'm not sure.
That's where the music store later was.
Was it the same? I was thinking it was next to that, but you could be right. So that was something to do. And again, I think it was just a nice place to walk through. Nobody minded kids walking through the stores and things like that.
So it sounds like you're describing a more sort of local, homey, friendly, maybe not so many tourists or not so many out of towner kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that was absolutely true, because I think at that time too, and I only know this from, again, my parents' business, because we sold plumbing, heating, kitchens, bathrooms, all of that stuff. The resorts that were further out of town we supplied all of that stuff back in the day when they were building or remodeling. So your tourists were more located at those resorts. You didn't see so much of the tourism in downtown Stroudsburg. It was more like just the friendly local hometown. So, you know, I remember too, you know, I could walk through Wyckoffs just browsing, looking for things, and I'd run into maybe my mom's friend or somebody that my dad knew, and, you know, we'd have ice cream, or I'd, you know, see kids my age and we'd just walk around and go down to the record store.
Which was next,
DJs.
next to?
Well, it was next to Lawrence Studio, which was next to the Sherman Theater. And then, of course, it was like, for some reason, the forbidden zone for me was after the Sherman. I don't know why. For some reason, I would go to walk to the Sherman Theater, and then there was always a couple stores after that, and it always seemed like such a big deal to go there when I was literally walking 5 more feet. I don't know why. I just was always afraid to go to that very end. But I do know there was a barber shop in the Army Navy store, and there was something else, and then next to that was the 5 Points Tavern. And I think I had heard all these horror stories about the 5 Points Tavern, so I never wanted to walk that far. So I always stopped, like, okay, I'm at the Sherman. So, and then I turn around and either come up the other side or back up this way. So.
Did you go to school around here?
No, that's the funny thing. I did not. I actually, through elementary school I did. So I originally went to Clearview School till 3rd grade. And then when we moved out to the Saylorsburg house, I went to Hamilton School. I went to Moravian Academy for high school.
I got you.
So that was when I kind of lost touch, so to speak, with Stroudsburg, because then I was in Bethlehem. So most of my activities were down there after school.
Now, I know you mentioned your dad's business and you suggested it was out here. Can you fill me in a little bit? Where was it?
Well, right now it's a parking lot for Stroudsburg High School. So it was just on the other side of the bridge from here. It was at 1018 West Main Street.
Okay.
So directly across from Wawa.
All right.
So now I hate driving by there. In fact, when I just came down here, I was like, oh, there's that parking lot again. Because that business actually had been there for many, many years in a different form. When my father bought the building, it was empty. And I think it had been empty since about 1955 when the flood came. Prior to that, it had been a paint store, it had been a bakery, a number of different things. And then he bought the building and then remodeled the whole thing, and then made it into a plumbing and heating store.
Well, you have a very good memory to remember all this
Gosh.
stuff.
Yeah, I do. And I'm fortunate for that, because there's stuff that I've talked to numerous people recently about downtown Stroudsburg, and like, oh, was it really, you know, this place where this store was located? People are like, what are you even talking about? And I'm like, I don't know, I just remember the funniest things. But yeah, and again, I spent a lot of time there. I ended up owning that same business later on, up until 1995.
Your dad's business?
Well, he did, and then when he originally started the business, he had 3 other business partners. And then eventually he would buy each one of them out, so that it ended up being, you know, 100% owned by him and my mom. And then at some point, I bought some of those shares, and then also was a co-owner with him. And then when he retired, then I took over the business, and then ran that till, like I said, 1995. So.
You talked about places to have lunch, but we haven't mentioned the diner there,
The Colonial Diner.
Colonial Diner, yeah. What do you remember about that?
Well, I don't know that I was actually there all that often, but I did eat lunch there a couple times. My father ate breakfast there every single day, so I do remember that.
So he'd drive to work and walk down and get breakfast then?
Yep.
No kidding.
That's exactly what he did, at some ridiculous hour of the morning that I couldn't even believe they were open, probably 5:30. And that's where he would meet a lot of these business people. And I think early on when he opened the business, that's actually where he kind of established a lot of those relationships, was at the Colonial Diner.
No kidding.
So I only ever remember going in there maybe once or twice. I think in his mind it was breakfast, so we never went there really for lunch or dinner. So, and that changed here and there also, and then it just disappeared.
Yeah, the building is gone completely.
Yeah. I did know for a long time what happened to that particular diner, and at the moment I'm blanking on it, but it was actually sold and went somewhere.
Well, there was a nightclub in the back at one point, right? Maybe
Hula hoops.
Hula hoops.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Wow.
And there was, I'm trying to think, there was some kind of a dinner club in there that was like a private club for a number of years, and I'm not really sure which social club it was, but that was there for quite a long time also in connection with that. And it was like, got to be an odd combination of things. And then they all kind of went out of business.
Well, a lot of memories. Do you remember anything else about the downtown area in general that you would like to talk about?
Nothing, really in general, other than, like I said, it was a very friendly town. It was just a nice town. You didn't have to worry about, walking down there and, getting hit over the head while you're carrying a large sum of money. You didn't have to worry about, like, getting hit by a car. Like, people seemed to be very, watchful because there were a lot of, kids and preteens and so on, but not in a bad way. I don't remember there ever being really any kind of problems, maybe a ruckus every once in a while at the Papa's Pizza, which then subsequently burned down, but there were...
I remember LeVar's pharmacy, right? Do you remember LeVar's pharmacy?
Yeah.
Just trying to think of other ones that have disappeared.
Well, there were a lot of pharmacies actually on Main Street, and they all switched positions numerous times. There was a Rite Aid for a long time. I think it was in the same spot as the Ray and Derek's. It was originally Ray and Derek's, and then it was Rite Aid, and then Rite Aid moved down further. And they were all next to Kresge's, which then turned into Kresge LeVar. And then it was just LeVar's. So there were a lot of different name changes to a lot of places. I think actually, wasn't it? I don't know. I actually had that written down. There was another drugstore that was down further, or pharmacy, I should say. But I don't remember the name of it. I'll think of it eventually, or find it. Like you said, there were a lot of restaurants. I think the only hotel, other than the Indian Queen, which obviously that burned down a long time before that, was actually the Penstrous / the Hilton / Best Western for a while. I think, and I could be wrong on this, but I think a long time ago, like decades before that, there was actually a hotel where Kentucky Fried Chicken is now, but that would have been a long time ago.
Do you remember a time when the downtown was a little bit maybe less prosperous than it seems to be now, like a little depressing? Was there a period where it was booming the way you described it, and then it kind of...
Yeah, and I want to say it was like maybe in the early 80s when that started happening, and I think a lot of that was when Wyckoffs left. What was the name of the store? Routsons came in then, and I don't remember them being here a long time, but I might have kind of been out of the loop at that point. And it seemed at that point, kind of the downtown kind of suffered because of that, because there was no major anchor store at the time. And then you kind of had Sears, which was kind of there and kind of not, and then they opened up like an emporium next to Wyckoffs where they just sold tools. They didn't sell clothing, nothing like that, until they went up to the mall. Penny's was downtown also, and yeah.
Where was Penny?
Penny's would have been directly across the side street from Newberries. So it started that next block, and they were there for a couple years. So you had those two stores there, and then, like I said, once they opened the mall, I think that was kind of the end of that, because Penny's obviously went up there.
All right, well, this has been great hearing about downtown Stroudsburg.
I have a lot more.
Well,
I have to tell you kind of a funny story about Wyckoffs. Besides the whole lunch counter and tea room, one of the highlights, and I use highlights loosely, was their bathrooms. And I always got such a kick out of the bathrooms.
Yeah, what's that all about?
At Wyckoffs. They were the only place that I have ever seen till this day that had self-sanitizing toilets. And it sounds really funny, but I've always kind of been into plumbing fixtures because I spent my entire life growing up working or, around my dad in a plumbing store. And you would go in there and their bathrooms were up on the second level and they were pay toilets, which I never understood why you have to pay for that. But they had 4 big stalls in the ladies' room and they had one free one, which of course there was always a line because nobody wanted to pay the 10 cents for the pay toilets. And it was always amazing, like when you actually either crawled under the door, which some of us did on occasion when we didn't have 10 cents or didn't want to pay 10 cents in silent protest, they had these self-sanitizing toilets. And they had like a blue light that was like, came over the top of the seat. And the seats would lift and go up or come down by themselves. So I have mentioned this to so many people, and it's funny, that's the one thing that almost everybody that I've mentioned Wyckoffs to has said, oh, you remember those bathrooms? And I'm like, I've never ever seen anything like that anywhere. And many, many years later, after they were long out of business and after Routson's was gone and it was Main Street Appliance, I actually had to go in there to buy an appliance, which was also frustrating because I sold major appliances up at Best Supply. And then once we were out of business and I needed appliances, I had to go somewhere else. Of course, I knew what the markup was, so I am not a fun customer in that area. And I remember going in there and asking them, do those bathrooms still work? And they're like, absolutely. And if you want to go up there, they're still there. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go do that because at that point I hadn't seen these for like almost 15 years and they were still there.
How about that?
Not with the pay. You didn't have to pay to use them anymore. But yeah, they're still there.
I sort of remember you walked up a flight of stairs and turned and had to walk up.
Yes.
Was there something on that landing, like a grandfather clock or a couch or something?
I think there was a couch on there. I think you could sit down and it had like a little table or something there, but yeah.
Huh. How about that?
And it was always so dramatic, like coming down from there. I always remember like as a little kid coming down with my mom, like I was like this, like royalty walking down this big staircase, like into a department store. So that was always kind of neat. And actually, I don't know, I never have thought about this since you just said that. I actually modeled once for Wyckoffs and did come down that staircase and then did like a runway kind of thing. So I modeled one time for them. So, and I think I was like 14 at the time or 15.
Did you know any of the Wyckoffs?
No, I didn't. So. Never met any of them, so they must not have traveled in the same circle as my parents. Never met any of them, as a matter of fact. So.
Well, I see you have some notes. Did you have some?
It was just, what I did was I listed out some different stores and things that were there. And most of them I've mentioned. The newsstands, there were 2 of them. There's Stroudsburg News and Variety, which was on this side of Main Street, where they sold newspapers, cigars, magazines. And directly across the street on the other side was the Borough News. And I always thought that was kind of interesting how 2 news and variety stores ended up like directly across from each other. And somewhere in the 90s, I actually was looked at purchasing the Stroudsburg News and Variety that was on this side. And then decided not to, but at that time it was owned by the Fushardis. I don't even know if they're still around, and I don't know what the reason was that I didn't go through with that, but that had been there forever, and I believe some semblance of it is still there. So So that was very interesting. In fact, the one that was across the street, the Borough News, was owned by the Glucks for a very long time. And everybody knew them. So I believe that Mrs. Gluck was in my mother's bridge club, and that's how we knew them. So there was also down on that side, there was a sporting goods store, which was Lim's Sporting Goods. They were around for a very long time. And in fact, they had closed their store before I had closed our store, and I had bought all their stock. So at one point in time, I had actually taken what was left in their store and sold that along with plumbing supplies. So I had a whole upstairs where I sold the remainder of their stuff.
No kidding.
So that had to have been in 1993, 4, something like that.
It was just an opportunity that presented itself. I mean, how do you go from plumbing supplies to sporting goods?
I don't know. I really don't know. I actually knew the Limbs, and so what happened was I went down there to buy something, and he's like, I just remember him saying to me, I don't know what I'm gonna do with all this stuff. And I said, just off the top of my head, I'll give you $300 or whatever it was for everything in the store. And he's like, good, you can have it. And I was like, okay. And I sent one of the guys who was one of my delivery people down there, and he just filled up a whole big steak body truck with everything left. It was like sneakers, jerseys, like hats, helmets, like baseball, like every kind of sporting equipment. And then I cleaned out a big area that we had set aside that we used to sell televisions in. We had stopped selling TVs before that and kind of had this room closed off, so I just reopened it and put all the sporting goods stuff in there. So I actually had closed the plumbing and heating business part, I'm pretty sure it was 1995, and I was trying to sell the property at that point, and this all came about because of Home Depot and Lowe's, and I won't get into that. And then I rented that building out and the warehouses to a person who turned it into a consignment shop. So at the same time, I kept selling sporting goods out of there, and then I also was like taking consignments, and then I pawned that all off on somebody else and then just closed the whole thing.
Well, you made reference to something that I think would be an interesting story. I don't know how much time we have here today, but that is the owner of a local business like Kramer's, Cashway, and when these big box stores open up and what that did to their businesses and those things.
Yeah, not helpful, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
That was kind of the beginning of the end, and some of the stories I can tell you about that is just that, what people didn't realize is, you go to the big box stores and they buy train car loads of appliances or whatever it is that they sell. As a small business, you're not buying that quantity. So your pricing's different. The quality's also different, which has long been a bone of contention with me, because a lot of times, take for instance Home Depot, they can advertise a Delta faucet, and did, with a certain model number. We sell the same model. The problem is the one that you bought at a box store would be made out of plastic on the inside. The ones that we would buy actually had metal components. People don't want to hear that. What they want to see is, hey, I can buy this for $26, you're charging $40.
Yeah. And
you can explain that because they were just produced differently. Like Delta, for instance, which is what we sold, they had a 636C model, and then they had a 636 without a letter behind it. The better one was the one without the letter behind it, but your box stores buy the ones with the letter behind it because it's a cheaper version. So they've got the price point. And so people would go there and they'd come back and say, oh, $20 difference, well, we're gonna buy it there. Unfortunately, I have my dad's personality, which was then go buy it there. And they did. But a lot of it was even with appliances, what I would get in, we sold strictly GE in the beginning, and then we moved into, adding a couple other brands, Frigidaire, Maytag. But we couldn't even buy it for what those larger stores are paying for it. It was just, it was a big price point difference. And that was why even your little plumbing supplies, O-rings and washers and stuff like that, we were paying double what they were selling it for. And so that's the problem, I think, that hardware stores, paint stores, a lot of the smaller businesses that dotted Main Street, what happened. So.
Did you have much contact with East Stroudsburg? Did you go over there much?
Not really.
No. Okay. Well, do you have any other stories about Main Street before we shift gears here?
Just trying to think. Not that I can think of at the moment.
Well, if you do,
I do. I'll just throw them in there.
But I know Amy is, and some of us are interested in the house that you
Sure.
grew up in, and this flag. What can you tell us about this flag?
This flag, my father and I actually found stuffed as a rag into a section of the dining room. The house, I love this flag.
It's a very neat flag.
Isn't it? I won't touch it. But I'm the one who unrolled it originally. Yeah, this was just a really neat advertising piece that someone had literally used as a rag. And in the room that they used as a dining room, there's 3 very precise corners, and there was a rounded one. And so when my dad went and had to replaster this, he was just kind of feeling along back there, and he's like, oh, there's a bunch of stuff in here. And lo and behold, he pulled out this wadded up rag, and I unfolded it, and that's what it was. So we kept that along with probably, almost 100 pieces of paper that are also kind of eaten away by mice or just, from the damp. Papers that were drawn up and signed by a justice of the peace that would have been around the same time. That particular person lived in that house at the time. So.
Where are those now?
Here.
Oh, okay.
They're
that's
all
what's
here.
in that folder.
So they are all here. I had actually recently brought in, I think, like 3 or 4 more. I found one that really interested me. It was hard giving that one up. It's a very big, long paper, and it was basically an indentured servant paperwork for someone. It's kind of hard to read, mostly because of the handwriting. That one's actually pretty much intact. And these were found all over the house. There were some of those types of papers, like up in the attic, under floorboards. The interesting part, you may get another donation, is when just speaking with my dad 2 weeks ago, he said, oh, did you get the ones out of the attic? I didn't know there were any in the attic. He said, oh yeah, I threw a whole handful of those under floorboards and then nailed over them. So he just told me this 2 weeks ago. So I have a crowbar and a hammer. So when I go down there on Saturday, I'm gonna see if I can find the rest of them, because they're probably not in very good shape, but then I don't know that. And he also claims that there's some utensils that he threw under these floorboards as well. So I'm gonna see if I can dig them out. So we'll see, because now the attic is cleaned out. So there's nothing left in the house at all. So it's easier, but yeah, so that's where this came from.
How about that? Now, you probably mentioned the name, but the house is known as what?
The Trach, T-R-A-C-H, Hunsicker house.
And where do those names come from?
Trach comes from actually Drach, D-R-A-C-H. The person that the house was built for was a Rudolf Drach, and he was actually a famous potter. His kiln was actually what's now across the street, but at the time there was obviously no road there, because this would have been in like 1789. He came up from Bucks County, and he was specialized in the slipware, redware. So he did this pottery there. Actually, he has one remaining piece that is in the Winterthur Museum that he actually did while he lived in that house. Joseph Trach, who was his, I'm pretty sure it was his son, although some things refer to him as his nephew, so I'm not 100% sure if it's 2 different people or it is, he changed the spelling. I think trying to get away from that German pronunciation of Drach, so he changed it to Trach. And so that's how the house was known. And then my parents had applied for it to be on the Pennsylvania Register of Historic Houses. And so that's how it got hyphenated into Trach-Hunsicker House.
And you said 1789, is that when it was built?
Yes.
1789.
Now, I had always been told, or we had always been told, that the barn had actually been built first, which would have made sense because being farmers at that time, they had to put the animals somewhere. So there could have been a frame house there prior to the stone house. I don't know that. I've never read or found anything that indicated that, but that would make sense. So it's a really nice piece of property. So
It is a beautiful piece of property.
it is.
It's on the level ground between two hills. I mean,
Yeah, it really is. The house, unfortunately, now needs a lot of work. I wish I wasn't selling it, but for me to move there would probably not be workable. So, unfortunately, it's kind of sad to look at it now because when you see it empty, it has a whole different connotation. That was kind of my dad's, what I want to say, like pride and joy. He bought it and it was pretty much almost falling down at the time. What's interesting is he bought it in 1969. Sight unseen by my mother. That was, I think, the last time he ever did anything without telling her, because I'm sure he'd still be hearing about it if they were in the same room at assisted living, which they're not.
So she didn't like it?
She did not like it. We lived up on Quentin Road, which was off of 5th Street, and she very much liked living there. And he would just drive around my dad on Sundays. Sometimes he and I would go, and we would just drive all these back roads. And he just saw this house one day, and I was with him, and he said, I have to have that house. And I was like 9 years old. So he went and talked to the people that lived in the farmhouse next door. I don't know how he knew that they had some family connection to this house. Turns out they did. And they kept telling him no, they wouldn't sell it to him. And like I said, the thing was really a wreck. Nobody had lived in it at that point for over 12 years. And he just wore him down. And then one day he stopped there and they said, yes, you can buy it. And he bought that house for $25,000. Wow. That was it. So I guess when we sell it, we'll have a capital gains issue, but, and then he took my mother to see it, and all I remember is she walked in there and she just stood there and cried. And she said, why would you buy this? And he said, because I'm gonna fix it up. And he did, and in the condition that, you know, it's been in all these years, he and my uncle did every bit of that work. It had no bathroom in it, which is kind of amazing because the house was unoccupied for 12 years. But that would have only gone back to like in the 1950s. And there was no bathroom in that house. There was an outhouse in the yard. And it had 4 bedrooms. There was barely electricity. There was a light bulb hanging like randomly in the kitchen, and that was the only lighting in that entire house. There was a sink, one of those big old metal sink cabinets. There was no water. There was a hand pump outside. So I think this was part of my mom's horror when she walked in there. And there was dead birds and bats and broken windows and stuff hanging from the ceiling and old wallpaper like peeling off, and the floor had holes in it. And that's why I think she was like, oh my God, what did you get us into? And yeah, and then he fixed it up, and was absolutely like gorgeous house. He redid the entire barn. So that's actually as nice as the house on the inside, honestly. There's a shed on the property that he turned into like an artist studio. And he did tear down one building that was so bad, like there was just nothing to do with that. And he did that. That was his life.
Wow.
So unfortunately, about probably 5 years ago, he just got disabled enough that he couldn't do any of the work. And unfortunately, nobody else did any of it either. My mother got to the point where she didn't want people coming in and out of the house, so a lot of stuff just kind of went.
So I'm curious, did your mom ever warm up to the house?
Oh, yes. In fact, unfortunately, like I said, she's in assisted living now. She has severe dementia. And one of the last things she said to me when I tried to reason with her to go into a facility, because I was very worried about her safety because my dad had to go first. All she said to me was, I love this house, and when I leave here, it'll be in a body bag and not before that. It didn't work out that way. So I did get her to leave, not voluntarily, but she did leave. And, you know, she really grew to love it over the time because my dad gave her free rein to pretty much decorate and do whatever she wanted. And she kept it very much that colonial style. So it actually became her pride and joy as well. And she could not even envision ever living anywhere else. So it's still there.
Yeah. Well, it is a magnificent property.
It is.
I noticed it when I was riding my bike past it, and then I saw a for sale sign, you know, eventually.
Mm-hmm.
And I went on Zillow, of course, and looked at all the photos. It's a beautiful place.
Yeah, and actually the real estate agent whose picture's on the sign is actually my son.
Ah.
So he's a real estate broker, so he's selling it.
All right, well, I don't have any other particular questions. Do you have any questions?
This is wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, no, that was very
Welcome.
interesting. Do you have, is there something we should have asked you about that we didn't ask you?
I don't think so, because like I said, I'm doing a lot of research on the house, and like I said, I'm almost ready to start writing that. So, you know, once I get it in book form, then it'll be
So
a
you're
lot
gonna write
easier.
like a kind of a history of the
Yeah.
house.
hmm
Oh,
And like the associated people that have lived there and
Mhm.
so on. So it's really interesting stuff that I found out. So I've
Great.
spent a lot of time down at Northampton County Historical Association also,
Uh-huh.
because that area was part of Northampton County up until, what, 1836. So, yeah.
Okay, well, great. Well, then we'll call it a day, and thanks very much.
You're
So,
welcome.
right.
Anytime.
Okay, I'm gonna turn this off.